Okay, if we want to just give it about 10 seconds.
Thank you all for joining us today. I'm Amy Lemon, professor and chairperson of English and Communication Studies at FIT, and I am delighted to introduce this event as part of our third annual Civility Week. Hosted by FIT's Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, Civility Week aims to help us all, as individuals and as a community, find respectful ways of living and learning in a higher education environment. I would like to start by thanking Dr. Joyce F. Brown, President of FIT, Dr. Ron Milan, FIT's Chief Diversity Officer, the Civility Week Committee, and Dr. Patrick Knisely, Dean of the School of Liberal Arts, for their support of this event, as well as my colleagues in the English and Communication Studies Department for their incredible efforts during these very challenging times. Now, I have the great honor of introducing Jericho Brown. Dr. Brown is the author of 3 acclaimed collections of poetry, the latest of which, The Tradition, 2019 was awarded the Pulitzer Prize. Jericho Brown grew up in Louisiana and worked as a speechwriter for the mayor of New Orleans before earning his PhD in literature and creative writing from the University of Houston. He also holds an MFA in creative writing from the University of New Orleans and graduated magna cum laude from Dillard University. He is the Charles Howard Candler Professor of Creative Writing and the director of the Creative Writing Program at Emory University in Atlanta. According to the New York Times, there are countless poets of the body, but the body in Brown's poetry serves as a nexus of the corporeal and conceptual. The body of his work isn't just a physical, individual one. It's a stand-in for various flawed institutions of power and belief: national history, religion, mythology, the justice system. On this day, the birthday of the late George Floyd, it is especially fitting that we are here to listen to the words of Jericho Brown and to focus on the theme of civility and its limits, speaking out through poetry. After the reading, audience members will be invited to ask questions using the comment feature in live stream. Please wait until prompted to post your questions so we don't miss anything. And now, please join me in enjoying the work of Jericho Brown.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction. I really appreciate that, Amy. Amy's always so kind to me. And I remember when we hung out at that wonderful writers conference in Pennsylvania. So I'm really glad that that we got to spend at least this virtual time together. And thank you to everybody else who had anything to do with me being here and with Civility Week happening. I was saying before we got public and in front of everybody, I do hope I get a chance to come to FIT in person at some point, because I just want to see the people in the building. You know, even just the name of the school sounds like a place where I need to be shaking people's hands. So when we're shaking people's hands again, I cannot wait to shake yours. I'm going to read just a few poems. Is that okay? Prayer of the Backhanded. Not the palm, not the pear tree switch, not the broomstick, nor the closest extension cord, not his braided belt, but God, bless the back of my daddy's hand, which, holding nothing tightly against me and not wrapped in leather, eliminated the air between itself and my cheek. Make full this dimpled cheek, unworthy of its unfisted print, and forgive my forgetting the love of a hand, hungry for reflex, a hand that took no thought of its target, like hail from a blind sky, involuntary, fast, but brutal in its bruising. Father, I bear the bridge of what might have been a broken nose. I lift to you what was a busted lip. Bless the boy who believes his best beatings lack intention, the mark of the beast. Bring back to life the son who glories in the sin of immediacy, calling it love. God, save the man whose arm, like an angel's invisible wing, may fly backward in fury, whether or not his son stands near. Help me hold in place my blazing jaw as I think to say, excuse me. Where I'm from, we always begin with prayer, so I wanted to start with a poem that's also a prayer. Now I'll start with a poem. Now I'll read a poem that makes use of vernacular in its title. Where I grew up, there are all these phrases and words in Louisiana that after I left Louisiana, I found out a few things. One thing that I found out was that I had an accent. And another thing that I found out was that there were all these words that other people didn't know and you couldn't find them in the dictionary. One of those phrases is the phrase 4 in the morning, which is that time of morning before the sun comes up. 4 in the morning. My mother grew morning glories that spilled onto the walkway toward her porch because she was a woman with land who showed as much by giving it color. She told me I could have whatever I worked for. That means she was an American. But she'd say it was because she believed in God. I am ashamed of America and confounded by God. I thank God for my citizenship in spite of the timer set on my life to write these words. I love my mother. I love Black women who plant flowers as sheepish as their sons. By the time the blooms unfurl themselves for a few hours of light, the women who tend them are already at work. Blue, I'll never know who started the lie that we are lazy, but I'd love to wake that bastard up at 4 in the morning, toss him in a truck, and drive him under God past every bus stop in America to see all those Black folk waiting to go work for whatever they want. A house, a boy to keep the lawn cut, some color in the yard. My God, we leave things green. Labor. I spent what light Saturday sent sweating and learned to cuss cutting grass for women kind enough to say they couldn't tell the damned difference between their mowed lawns and their vacuumed carpets just before handing over a $5 bill rolled tighter than a joint and asking me in to change a few light bulbs. I called those women old because they wouldn't move out of a chair without my help or walk without a hand at the base of their backs. I called them old, and they must have been. They're all dead now, dead and in the earth I once tended. The loneliest people have the earth to love and not one friend their own age, only mothers to baby them and big sisters to boss them around, women they want to please and pray for the chance to say please to. I don't do that kind of work anymore. My job is to look at the childhood I hated and say, I once had something to do with my hands. Uh, this poem makes use of the epic poem by Homer called the Odyssey, and I think y'all will hear some of that come through in this poem. Hero, hero. She never knew one of us from another, so my brothers and I grew up fighting over our mother's mind. Like sun-colored suitors in a Greek myth, we were willing to do evil. We kept chocolate around our mouths. The last of her mother's lot. She cried at funerals, cried when she whipped me. She whipped me daily. I am most interested in people who declare gratitude for their childhood beatings. None of them took what my mother gave, waking us for school with sharp slaps to our bare thighs. That side of the family is darker. I should be grateful, so I will be. No one on earth knows how many abortions happened before a woman risked her freedom by giving that risk a name, by taking it to breast. I don't know why I am alive now, that I still cannot impress the woman who whipped me into being. I turned my mother into a grandmother. She thanks me by kissing my sons. Gratitude is black. Black as a hero returning from war to a country that banked on his death. Thank God. It can't get much darker than that. I talked a little bit about words and phrases from the South, where I'm from, and from Louisiana in particular. This next poem is titled after one of those words that people don't say all over. The word is nim, and the word means that person and everyone you associate with that person. If you went to high school with somebody, you see them in the grocery store, you hadn't seen them in a long time. But when you were in school with them, you knew their family. You might say to them, "Hey, how you doing? How is your mama and them?" And they said to say goodnight and not goodbye, unplugged the TV when it rained. They hid money in mattresses, so to sleep on decisions. Some of their children were not their children. Some of their parents had no birth dates. They could sweat a cold out of you. They'd wake without an alarm telling them to. Even the short ones reached certain shelves. Even the skinny cooked animals too quick to catch. And I don't care how ugly one of them arrived. That one got married to somebody fine. They fed families with change and wiped their kitchens clean. Then another century came. People like me forgot their names. This next poem makes use of the myth of Ganymede, another Greek myth. Poets can't get enough of Greek myth. Ganymede. A man trades his son for horses. That's the version I prefer. I like the safety of it. No one at fault, everyone rewarded. God gets the boy. The boy becomes immortal. His father rides until grief sounds as good as the gallop of an animal born to carry those who patrol our inherited kingdom. When we look at myth this way, nobody bothers saying, rape. I mean, don't you want God to want you? Don't you dream of someone with wings taking you up? And when the master comes for our children, he smells like the men who own stables in heaven, that far terrain between promise and apology. No one has to convince us. The people of my country believe we can't be hurt if we can be bought. From the King James Version of the Bible, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that ye present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. Romans 12:1. I will begin with the body. In the year of our Lord, porous and wet, love-racked and willing. In my 23rd year, a certain obsession overtook my body, or I should say, I let a man touch me until I bled, until my blood met his hunger, and so was changed, was given a new name, as is the practice among my people, who are several and whole, holy and acceptable. On the whole, hurt by me, they will not call me brother. Hear me coming, and they cross their legs. As men are wont to hate women, as women are taught to hate themselves, they hate a woman they smell in me. Every muscle of her body clenched in fits beneath men, heavy as heaven. My body, dear, dying, sacrifice, desirous as I will be, black as I am. Say thank you. Say I'm sorry. I don't know whose side you're on, but I am here for the people who work in grocery stores that glow in the morning and close down for deep cleaning at night, right up the street and in cities I mispronounce, in towns too tiny for my big black car to quit, and in every wide corner of Kansas where going to school means at least one field trip to a slaughterhouse. I want so little. Another leather-bound book, a gimlet with a lavender gin, bread so good when I taste it I can tell you how it's made. I'd like us to rethink what it is to be a nation. I'm in a mood about America today. I have PTSD about the Lord. God save the people who work in grocery stores. They know a bit of glamour is a lot of glamour. They know how much it costs for the eldest of us to eat. Save my loves and not my sentences. Before I see them, I draw a mole near my left dimple, add flair to the smile they can't see behind my mask. I grin or lie, or maybe I wear the mouth of a beast. I eat wild animals, while some of us grow up knowing what gnocchi is. The people who work at the grocery don't care. They say, thank you. They say, sorry, we don't sell motor oil anymore, with a grief so thick you could touch it. Go on, touch it. It is early. It is late. They have washed their hands. They have washed their hands for you, and they take the bus home. I wrote this next poem after finding out about and being confounded by the very long list of people who have supposedly committed suicide while in police custody. That list includes people like Jesus Huerta in North Carolina, who, after having been handcuffed, after having been patted down, while on the walk from the police cruiser to the building where he was to be booked, somehow managed to shoot himself in the back corner of his head. Victor White III in Louisiana, where I'm from, who, after having been patted down, after having been handcuffed, while handcuffed, sitting in the backseat of a police car, somehow managed to shoot himself in the upper back. Sandra Bland, who, after a day of fighting for her life in video that many of us have seen, was put in a cell where she hanged herself with a trash bag. In that same cell, there is a live feed of her, and that live feed goes out for what we're told it goes out because of technical difficulty, and so we don't see that video of her in the cell anymore. The coroner says that she must have hung herself with a trash bag at the same moment that that video feed goes out. Bullet points. I will not shoot myself in the head, and I will not shoot myself in the back, and I will not hang myself with a trash bag. And if I do, I promise you, I will not do it in a police car while handcuffed, or in the jail cell of a town I only know the name of because I have to drive through it to get home. Yes, I may be at risk, but I promise you, I trust the maggots who live beneath the floorboards of my house to do what they must to any carcass more than I trust an officer of the law of the land to shut my eyes like a man of God might, or to cover me with a sheet so clean my mother could have used it to tuck me in. When I kill me, I will do it the same way most Americans do. I promise you, cigarette smoke, or a piece of meat on which I choke, or so broke I freeze in one of these winters we keep calling worst. I promise if you hear of me dead anywhere near a cop, then that cop killed me. He took me from us and left my body, which is, no matter what we've been taught, greater than the settlement a city can pay a mother to stop crying, and more beautiful than the new bullet fished from the folds of my brain. I oh, there we are. I had a moment of technical difficulty. Crossing. The water is one thing, and one thing for miles. The water is one thing, making this bridge built over the water another. Walk it early. Walk it back when the day goes dim. Everyone rising just to find a way toward rest again. We work, start on one side of the day like a planet's only sun, our eyes straight until the flame sinks. The flame sinks. Thank God, I'm different. I figured and counted. I'm not crossing to cross back. I'm set on something vast. It reaches long as the sea. I'm more than a conqueror, bigger than bravery. I don't march. I'm the one who leaps. I'm going to finish with just a few love poems. I hope it's okay if I read you some love poems. It's important to ask for consent. There's a poem titled after one of my favorite songs. It's a standard that you can hear almost anyone sing. My favorite version of it is it's a song called "Lush Life," and one of my favorite versions of "Lush Life" is by the singer Natalie Cole. And obviously, her father had a really great version. "Lush Life" was written by Billy Strayhorn while he was still a teenager. Every time I think about the fact that Billy Strayhorn wrote a song that great and that complex while he was still a teenager, every time I think about Billy Strayhorn writing Lush Life when he was so young, I really hate Billy Strayhorn. And the other thing about this song that's interesting is the most recent of versions that I've heard is a version by or famous versions of it is a version by Queen Latifah, which is interesting at least to hear. Um, Track 1, Lush Life. The woman with the microphone sings to hurt you, to see you shake your head. The mic may as well be a leather belt. You drive to the center of town to be whipped by a woman's voice. You can't tell the difference between a leather belt and a lover's tongue. A lover's tongue might call you bitch, a term of endearment where you come from, a kind of compliment preceded by the word sing in certain nightclubs. A lush little tongue you have. You can yell, sang bitch, and I love you with a shot of Patron at the end of each phrase from the same bar stool every Saturday night. But you can't remember your father's leather belt without shaking your head. That's what satisfies her, the woman with the microphone. She does not mean to entertain you, and neither do I. Speak to me in a lover's tongue. Call me your bitch, and I'll sing the whole night long. I'll just finish with one more poem. I'm going to read for you the last poem in my most recent book. I won't say last. Hopefully, I'll write another book someday. I'll read you the last poem in my most recent book. It's also a duplex. The duplex is a form I invented, and the duplex is it's a form that unites the hustle, the sonnet, and the blues poem. There are also elements in the form that have to do with the pantoum and the villanelle. Um, and the only thing you need to know about this particular duplex is that there's actually an extra layer of form. It's also a cento. As y'all know, a cento is a poem that is completely made up of lines from other poems, usually by other poets. This cento, so you would take a single line from 10 different poems to make one poem of 10 lines is how the cento works. This cento is a little different because every one of the lines in this cento come from the other duplexes in the book. I really love reading I love reading the last poem in the book because it's the last poem. It's the last duplex, and it's also proof that poetry is the superior art. Because fiction writers can't read you their last page, baby. Um, Duplex, Cento. My last love drove a burgundy car, color of a rash, a symptom of sickness. We were the symptoms, the road, our sickness. None of our fights ended where they began. None of the beaten end where they began. Any man in love can cause a messy corpse. But I didn't want to leave a messy corpse obliterated in some lilied field, stench obliterating lilies of the field, the murderer young and unreasonable. He was so young, so unreasonable, steadfast and awful, tall as my father, steadfast and awful. My tall father was my first love. He drove a burgundy car. Thank y'all so much.
Thank you, Jericho.
Thank
You
you.
can just picture people all over the place, probably all over the world, going, woo! Like that. That was amazing. I know you've done quite a few virtual events. It takes a little while to get used to like silence.
Yeah, it's different. Well, it's not even just the silence. It's just when you use the webinar as opposed to the other feature, not even being able to see, especially if you're like trying to protect bandwidth as you would on WebEx, not being able to see people is really weird. But it's also become now, I mean, at first it was very frustrating, but now it's become more fun because I can just imagine whoever I want to imagine and just imagine reading to that person or those people. Which is a new thing I'm doing. So it's been working.
That's great. It was so beautiful. Thank you so very much. I wanted to start, we're going to be taking some questions. If people can put those in the chat and live stream. We'll be taking as many questions as we can, as we have time for before 6 o'clock. But I wanted to start out. I'm so glad you ended with some love poems because there's a beautiful essay that you have in a book called The Racial Imaginary, edited by Claudia Rankin, Beth Lafreda, and Max King Cap, called Love the Masters. And I just want to read a little bit of it to you and to everyone here and to kind of start off this conversation this way. Every poem is a love poem. Every poem is a political poem. So say the masters. Every love poem is political. Every political poem must fall in love. The political poem has an aim, whether the poet is aware of it or not. When I say I love you, I mean for you to understand that I exist in relation to you and to your view of me. And then one more little nugget here. Every poem challenges or supports the status quo. So say the masters. Poets whose work supports the status quo often fail to acknowledge that their poems are just as political as poets whose work questions it. I felt like that would be a great tie-in to this theme of the limits of civility and using poetry to speak out within a tradition. You are someone whose poetry uses traditions and turns them upside down with something like the duplex, the form that's a hybrid of several received forms. Maybe you could talk a bit more about how that works for you as a creative artist.
Can you say just the last part again?
How does, say, challenging the status quo by working within and against received modes in your art form?
Yeah. Well, I'll say this. I think it's very important that you know everything you can possibly know about something that you want to be a part of. And before I was a poet, I was a person who just desperately wanted to be a poet. You know what I mean? Which is to say that I was always a poet. You know, I always had a deep seated interest in language and the sounds of words the ways of saying things in Black vernacular in particular. I remember my grandmother would say things on the porch, and I would be not just delighted by the story she told, but her way of telling the stories, how she got things across. And so when it became clear to me that that was something I could do with my life, that I could make art out of this, that I could make these little machines, these little objects that carry that thing that I love, poems. I understood I would also have to read a bunch of poetry. That often seems strange to people. Like, why are you reading poetry if you want to write poems? Well, nobody ever thinks that LeBron James hasn't seen a basketball game. Do you know what I mean? Many of us haven't actually read the Constitution of the United States of America, but I bet you Barack Obama has. Do you understand what I'm saying? So there's a way that it becomes really important, I think, for us to be aware of where we come from and of what has been possible so far in terms of where we come from. So, this is why, for instance, it's important, I think, to read, people like to ban books, but I like knowing that people said awful things about me. So I like reading, or I like the fact that people can read Huckleberry Finn without making it instructive, or even to read Mein Kampf without making it instructive, right? So that we are aware of these things as they come up, and so that we can be ready to fight against them. So for me, I think about form in that way. It's very important to me that I know what all the forms are, because any one of them could be a vehicle that a poem that is coming to me needs to speak through. A poem might need to speak through a certain form, a villanelle, for instance. So if I'm getting a poem and I notice that it's repeating lines every so often, I can think, oh, well, maybe this is a villanelle, right? I'm getting a poem and I'm noticing certain things about a rhyme pattern developing even as I'm just writing it, and I can think, oh, maybe this might be a sonnet. So I first of all have to know what the forms are. So that's all number one, is just widening your breadth of knowledge. And then after you widen your breadth of knowledge, it is then time to institute yourself, to figure out where you don't fit in that breadth of knowledge. And there are so many places where I don't fit. I mean, even in the quote that you read, I'm always amazed that people are questioning the fact of political poetry when all the poems I've ever read are political. I'm amazed that people like to make the fact of love poems slight, as if love poems are somehow in and of themselves because they are about love, because they are about romantic love, or because they're about eros, or because they're about the erotic or sex, that is somehow trite automatically, when that's actually the history of poetry. So how could it be trite? Do you know what I mean? So I find that part of what I'm doing when I'm making a sonnet, or when I'm inventing a form, one of the things that I'm doing is making sure that all of who I am is in it. Therefore, I bring to that form what it may have denied in the past. That's why it's important to me that I take the sonnet and interlace it with the blues. Because then I bring something that is most definitely a Black form into this form that, no matter how many Black people write it, we have yet to think of as having Black possibility. More people in the United States today are probably learning about the sonnet from Gwendolyn Brooks's poems than they are from Robert Frost's poems. So that's the kind of thing that I'm interested in. When I'm writing poems, I'm just interested in a full, and it's not, by the way, what I'm saying here is not original. I mean, this is actually what the tradition and the individual talent says, that essay by T.S. Eliot, that our job as poets is to work within the tradition and always be instituting and specifying and distinguishing ourselves within that tradition. I'm in the tradition, and yet here's what I contribute to it. I always tell my students to think of themselves as X-Men. I used to tell my students to think of themselves as Greek gods, but then my students didn't know who the Greek gods were anymore. And so now I say, you know, all of you have a power. Each of you in this room, you're in a pantheon, and each of you has your own power. You know, you got a laser coming out of your eye, you got super strength. And when you write your poems, the things that your poems need to do is the thing that only you can do in a poem. That's why when we read Donald Justice's poems, we don't have to see Donald Justice's name to know they're his poems. They sound like Donald Justice. They look like Donald Justice. When we read Allen Ginsberg's poems, we know those are Allen Ginsberg's poems. When we see Audre Lorde's poems, we understand, oh, that's Audre Lorde. The same way when we hear musical artists, when I hear Brandy on the radio, nobody has to tell me that's Brandy. I know what Brandy sounds like. I know what Diana Ross sounds like. So those kinds of things I think are what I'm interested in. I'm interested in making something that sounds like something only Jericho Brown can make. Did I answer you, or did I just talk a lot?
You did both, and it was wonderful. And I wanted to just circle back. We are starting to get some really great questions, and we even have a request for some another poem. But before we get there, I just kind of want to circle back to this idea of the love poem being political and vice versa.
Yeah.
How do you feel about someone maybe suggesting you are both a love poet and a political poet?
Yeah, I feel like that's true. I'm happy to have. I would love. I mean, to be quite honest with you, I wish. I mean, Louise feels this way too, which is interesting. I had a conversation with Louise Glick a few years. I mean, this is a long time ago. I'm not best friends with Louise Glick or anything.
Can we just say, for those who don't know, Nobel Prize poet,
most recent Nobel Prize winner in literature.
Yeah,
Louise Glick, whose poems I've admired for a very long time, and who I've had occasion to be around many times. And I remember our conversations because she is as deep as her poems. And in one conversation, I remember her saying that, you know, people are always talking about the austerity of her poems or the cutting edge honesty of her poems. And she's like, when are they going to call me a love poet? They're all just love poems. You know what I mean? And that's sort of how I feel about my poems. You write a poem like Bullet Points, and suddenly you're a political poet. But it sounds to me like Bullet Points is a prayer. That poem is begging over and over again that the speaker be remembered and that he be heard. That poem invokes 3 different times, I think, in the poem. I'm not looking at it. Invokes a mother, right? That's a love poem. Definitely the poems in the 3rd section of this book it's a bunch of love poems in the 3rd section of my most recent book. So that's, and I would like for people to remember me for that as well as for the political nature of my poems. But I would also like for people to find that in all of the poems that they read by anybody. And if they can't find it, to wonder why.
So from the chat, we have Rebecca saying, I would love if you could read the 2nd Duplex and discuss the meaning of the field of flowers.
I don't know if I can discuss the meaning, but I'll read the poem. You know, I'll say this after I read the poem. I think the 2nd Duplex is the opposite of rape is understanding. Is that correct? I think so, yeah. Duplex. The opposite of rape is understanding. A field of flowers called paintbrushes. A field of flowers called paintbrushes, though the spring be less than actual. Though the spring be less than actual, men roam shirtless as if none ever hurt me. Men roam that myth. In truth, one hurt me. I want to obliterate the flowered field, to obliterate my need for the field and raise a building above the grasses, a building of prayer against the grasses. My body a temple in disrepair. My body is a temple in disrepair. The opposite of rape is understanding. So I can give what I think of as a on the ground reading of what is happening in the poem, but I don't like. I mean, I'm sorry, I forgot the name. What name did you say?
Rebecca.
Rebecca. I'm not trying to sidestep your question. It's just that readers need to be able to come to meaning on their own. And then when a poet starts telling readers what something means, then that eliminates the other valences, the other meanings that might be gained from the poem. And often, and this is true, I'm sorry it's true, but it is, often a poet doesn't know what their poem, they don't know what their poems mean. They just know they got it right. Do y'all know what I'm saying? Because a poem is a thing of beauty, and for the poet making the poem, an organic thing of beauty, and should be to the reader too. If you're reading a poem that you love when you're 20, when you read that poem again when you're 30, you should see things you didn't see before. Do you know what I mean? So meaning is harder, I think, to do if you're a poet. The best way I have of understanding of explaining that is, I'll talk about the poem, but I do want to say this. The best way I have of explaining that is, a poem is a thing of beauty. First and foremost, a poem is a thing of beauty. What else is a thing of beauty? A tree. Everybody who's watching me right now has a tree. As soon as I say it, you think of your tree, right? You have some tree in your life. Maybe you kissed under it. Maybe you climbed it. Maybe something awful happened in front of it. But that's your tree. And you think of it almost as soon as I mention your tree. What you don't, and when you think of that tree, you think it is beautiful. You think of it as a thing of beauty, but you do not try to explicate it. You do not look at the tree and say, oh, well, this branch in the 19th century represents the theory of, you don't do that to your damn tree, right? And you don't do that to a baby. Do y'all follow what I'm saying? You don't do that to a really good meal. And so the way I think of poems is the way I think of the sight of a baby, or the being in the midst of and having had a really good meal. I mean, there are meals that we've had that many of us still remember the experience of, or a tree. In this poem in particular, though, the opposite of rape is understanding. A field of flowers called paintbrushes, a field of flowers called paintbrushes, though the spring be less than actual, is the first sentence. So there's rape, and then there's rape, and then there's the opposite. And what's the opposite? The opposite is being able to enjoy and understand a field of paintbrushes. Paintbrushes are a kind of flower in Texas that I saw once in a field in Round Top, Texas. And I said, what are those? And somebody said, those are paintbrushes. And I believed them. And then the poem goes on to say, though the spring be less than actual, men roam shirtless as if none ever hurt me. So that's the opposite of rape is a field where you understand that field and you see men roaming it without a shirt, which, by the way, is nice to think about right now. Hi. So then I've been indoors. I've been in shelter in place for a while. Anyway, so men roam that myth. In truth, one hurt me. So obviously, or maybe not so obviously, it seems to me that the poem is saying that field does not exist, which means what does exist is the rape. In truth, one hurt me. And the speaker then turns to an I to say, I want to obliterate the flower field, to obliterate my need for the field. Why do I need the field? Because I want the opposite of rape. Why would I want the opposite of rape? Because I've been raped. I want to obliterate the flowered field, to obliterate my need for the field and raise a building above the grasses, a building of prayer against the grasses, my body a temple in disrepair. My body is a temple in disrepair. The opposite of rape is understanding. So I hope that's more clear for you.
Beautiful explication.
Thank you.
We're getting a couple of questions in the chat about poets that you admire, poets that you sort of grew up on. I think this also can still relate to this idea of the masters, the poets. I mean, that's a very loaded word. Maybe you could talk about that a little bit and what you gleaned from them, and maybe how you departed from them.
Yeah, well, who knows how I departed? I should probably, if anything, I need to be doing more gleaning. My favorite poet is probably the poet Lucille Clifton. I really do. Maybe my other favorite poet really is Louise Glick. I wrote my when I was getting a PhD, I did my comps. I did one set of my composition, my comprehensive exams, completely on the poetry of Louise Glick. Langston Hughes's shorter poems have been very influential to me. One of my favorite books of poetry is by a woman named Christine Garren, Garren. That book is called Among the Monarchs. Terrence Hayes was a personal mentor of mine. As a matter of fact, around the same age, I had three wonderful mentors who I find that I can't talk about without getting emotional. That's interesting. Sorry. When I was a young person, I didn't care about anything but poetry, and it's almost as if I always feel like God. I'll tell you what happened to me. As a kid, I was well, I shouldn't say kid because y'all are like, that's not a kid, that's a grown ass man. But I felt like a kid. And if when I look back at myself, I see a kid. When I finished college, I didn't know what I was going to do. And I got this job somehow working for the mayor of New Orleans, this very sort of low entry level position in his communications office, in the press office, public relations office. And in the meantime, I was trying to write my poems. And eventually I would work my way up in that job, and I became the speechwriter for the mayor of New Orleans. But in the meantime, but while that was happening, all I really wanted was to write my poems and to figure out how to make that my life. And somehow, as if I willed it, at that same time, Terrence Hayes moved to New Orleans, Toy Derricott moved to New Orleans, and Major Jackson moved to New Orleans. I found a workshop for African-American writers called the No More Literary Society, which was facilitated by a writer named Kalamu Yasalam. And I started an MFA program where my teachers were Kay Murphy and John Gary. And I really felt like I had, along with Mona Lisa Saloy and Brenda Marie Osby, I felt like I was drawing these people to me. And I still feel such a supreme gratitude that at this very pivotal moment in my life, I couldn't keep the poetry away. It kept coming to me and coming in the form of these people who could only express love and care for this desire that I clearly had in my heart. And Terrence Hayes, Natasha Trethwaite, and Claudia Rankin. Terrence was never my teacher, but Natasha and Claudia was my teacher when I was getting my PhD. My literal, I would go to class and she was my teacher. And she would say, "You think that's a poem?" And talk to me. Who that one would talk to me crazy? But Claudia, Natasha, and Terrence were like this great triumvirate. I love their work, but what I really love about them is that they took care of letting me know how to live this life, how to be a poet, how to take care of myself, how to find time to write, and what to do with that writing once I had made it, how to keep my head down and get my goddamn work done. And I really appreciate them for that. So I would think of them as really large influences, and there are many more, but it's hard to narrow down influence. Like Stevie Wonder is obviously a really big influence.
Oh, sure.
There's a way, and poets don't talk about this enough, but as it relates to visual art, as it relates to music, popular music, there are certain things that we've seen and that we have in common that really must be making a difference to our work. Okay, I answered that question a long time. Sorry.
That was amazing. No, I mean, what a wonderful upbringing, shall we say?
Yeah.
Alisa has a question that's somewhat related. What response have you received from your community in Louisiana in regards to your writing?
Oh, I was on the cover of the Shreveport Sun. And, my family had this big Zoom party for me after I won the Pulitzer. And before that, my cousins were very aware and very supportive of my writing. I don't show my writing to people in my family. I think that's a bad idea. I don't know where people get that from. I think that's the craziest, weirdest, strangest thing in the world to do. So I don't do that. But, because even before the Pulitzer, it became, because of social media mostly, it became kind of obvious that I was doing this thing where I stood up in front of people and read poems, or that I would publish poems. Many of my cousins would find those and be really supportive of my work. So on the whole, it's been great. I mean, it's really been wonderful, actually.
That's wonderful. We have a couple questions that have to do with sort of the workings of a poet. And one of them is from Zach, one of my students. How do you decide what is a story/poem you want to share, as opposed to keeping it to yourself or to people close to you? So I guess the public versus the private writing.
Yeah. I haven't written a poem that I thought I should be keeping to myself. When I'm writing a poem, I'm trying to, I think I said this before, but I really do. When I write poems, I write them to use. So when I'm making a poem, I'm making my own personal microwave, or my own personal DVR, or my own I'm like looking around my house. It's like I'm making a car. And then after I've made the car, I'm like, oh, look, there's never been a car before. Maybe somebody else can drive it, right? Oh, look, so when I say microwave, what I mean is I make the first microwave because I make a poem that's never been made before. And then I send the poem out into the world because somebody else might be able to warm up their food with it. And they are welcome to that because I'm on to another machine. So I don't really think about writing to keep to myself and writing to show to the world. I don't send poems out to magazines or make books to be published until after my friends have read them. I think the community of poets is like no other artist community. And what's been really important to me is that I have close friends who read for me and I read their poems. And that's how I know something's ready, because they tell me this is not ready. Or they tell me this is really great, you should send it out somewhere, which I still don't do. I never send poems out until I'm done with a book. And then when I'm finished with a book, I'll send poems out, which is why it always seems like people are always like, oh, Jericho, you're all over the place. I've seen you in so many magazines. And I'm like, you didn't pay attention to the 4 years that you didn't see me in any magazines. It's just that I'm sending out often I'm sending out 45 poems to various magazines at the same time. So when they get taken, they all come out at the same time, and they all come out right before a book. So because I've worked in public relations, I sort of think about magazines and book publishing with a much more promotional and public relations mind than I do with my writer's mind. And I don't like to confuse the two. And so when I'm writing, that's all I want to be doing. I don't want to be out here trying to sell a book, because I think it taints the thing I'm trying to do when I'm trying to write.
That's a great. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
By taints, what I mean is, I'm sorry, but I just thought of this. I should say this and make it clear. By taints, what I mean is I need to be writing the poems of my life. I need to be writing the poems only I can write. I need to be writing the poems necessary for my soul. I don't need to be writing poems that I think people are going to like. I don't need to be trying to write the next thing that's going to be hot on Twitter. Do you know what I'm saying? And so if you really bog yourself down with a bunch of worrying about, well, what's going to sell, then you're not going to make what you're really supposed to be making.
I think you've answered another question. Sophia asks, any advice to someone wanting to write and publish poetry? And you've talked a lot about your own process just now.
Yeah, I can probably add, my real advice is, my first and the greatest advice is to live, to live a big life and have the experiences you want to have. When I was a young person, I was in a room where someone asked, I was a senior in college, and somebody asked Nikki Giovanni, who visited my college, what's her advice for writers? And she said, never say no. And I've been living under that advice for my entire life ever since then. She said it, I figured it was true. I like to tell my students, never say no, except wear a condom. So I don't, I tell them, never say no, but have a plan. So I think it's important to have as many experiences as you can possibly have, to experience as much joy as you can have, because then that gives you something to write about. But I also think it's important that you institute for yourself discipline, and that can be done through writing and or reading. And by discipline and reading, when I was a young person, I would go to the local Barnes and Noble, to the poetry section. And I would start with the letter A, and I would open a book and read the first two lines of a poem. And if I was bored by the third line, I'd put the book back and go to the next book. And when I finally would get through the entirety of a first poem, I would say, I guess this book is good enough for me to read the rest of it. And that's how I got a lot of reading done. When I was in graduate school, I was reading a book a day. That's not an exaggeration. So it just, you have to be invested, and you have to prove the investment to yourself. What you have to be able to say before you go to sleep at night: what did I do for myself as an artist today? What did I do for my poems today? And you got to be able to say you did something for not for somebody else. You have to be able to say you did something for your poems in the realm of reading and or writing every day. And if you can get 30 days of that in, you are going to be well on your way to a lifetime.
I am also thinking of something that you said earlier today with a kind of a smaller group of students about taking risks. And I think this is really important for the FIT community, which has a lot of creators, a lot of creative people in various ways. And when they're in school is the time they can take those risks, right? And really branch out and try things before they're out in sort of the industry and the working world or the art world. You said you have the right to take risks that your heart is called to. That's what you said.
Yeah. I'm not saying to be risky. I'm saying to take risks. You know what I'm saying? I'm not sending anybody toward damaging behavior. I am telling you there are things that you love, and you love them. And so you should try them out. You should see how far they can go, because that's where the answer is going to be for you in particular. And it's also a good idea to start small. When you start a discipline, start small. When you start a practice, start small. I know my students aren't going to read a book a day like I was doing in graduate school. So I tell them to read 5 poems a day. And I assign that. I make that a literal assignment. 5 pages of poetry by different poets in an anthology that they have to read one of a day for 30 days. And when I tell y'all, they're in that 30-day period, not because of my teaching, but because of their reading, their poems do that. Like, it's just amazing how much their poems change. But you can't have that change unless you are experiencing. That thing doesn't come out of you if it hasn't gone in you. You've got to get poetry in you to get poetry to come out. And that's the same for anything else. You got to get tennis in you if you want tennis to come out. You got to get basketball in you if you want basketball to come out. You got to get money in you if you want money to come out. Any way you look at it, you've got to experience the thing from the outside in order to get it inside, in order to put it out in the world.
So we're almost to the end of our wonderful hour with you. Once something is out in the world, once poems, Pulitzer Prize winning book, the poems of a Nobel winner, can poetry make something happen, do you think? Politically, socially?
Yes, but it makes something happen politically, socially, to individuals, not to masses of people. And what we hope for is reaching the right individual. Poetry works the way I imagine Christianity should work. So many of us are Christians because Constantinople was. It worked. If you get a Roman emperor interested in your religion, then he makes that the religion of the land. And Christianity reached the right person. And so what you want from your poems isn't to please everybody. You don't want to make a poem that's going to somehow automatically change a law. You want to make the best poems you make, and you want to put them out in the world. And then, yeah, of course, a lawmaker might read that particular poem. So that's what I think about them. But what I really think about poems as it relates to the social, as it relates to the political, as it relates to justice, is that poems actually do more justice for the soul of the writer than for anybody else who reads the poem. Me writing poems about my dad in my first book changed my relationship to my father and helped me better understand why he was a nut. Do you know what I'm saying? Those poems that I wrote engendered compassion that I didn't otherwise have for my real life dad. And that's what we should really be doing with our poems, is taking care of ourselves, right? What is your relationship to the tree in your poem? What is your relationship to the bird? What is your relationship to the mother? What is your relationship to the I, to the self in the poem? What do you say about yourself in the poems? And why would you say that? Do you know what I mean? And if you're really answering those questions and asking those questions as you write your poems, somebody else will catch on. But I wouldn't be worried about political movement. If there's a movement in one's own soul, then there will be a movement in other souls, is what I have to believe.
Jericho Brown, thank you so much for being with us this evening.
Thank you.
And I really do hope that we'll be able to have you on our campus in person someday again, as you had discussed. And wishing you all the best. And have a wonderful evening, everyone. Thank you all for joining us.
I'm going to take a nap. Saw y'all later. Bye.
Yeah, take good care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.